Commander Vex Prime adjusted his ceremonial sash for the 15th time, his 4 eyes scanning the grand examination hall of the Galactic Defense Academy. Today marked the final assessment for the most promising tactical analysts from across 17 star systems. The cream of the crop, he mused, watching as candidates from various species filed into their assigned seats. "Nervous, Commander?" asked his aide, Lieutenant Grix, her tentacles twitching with barely contained excitement. "Hardly," Vex Prime replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor. "It's just that this year's batch includes representatives from some rather volatile regions." The examination hall buzzed with tension as candidates settled into their positions. Towering Krellians with their crystalline exoskeletons dominated the back rows, while the nimble Zephyrians perched delicately in the middle sections. Near the front, a cluster of Valorian warriors sat rigid, their scaled faces set in expressions of grim determination. And then there was row 3. Vex Prime's gaze lingered on the human female seated there, her unremarkable appearance almost comical among the assembled aliens. She wore simple clothing, her brown hair tied back in what humans called a ponytail, and she seemed to be. Was she actually yawning? "Extraordinary," muttered Dr. Kelvin, the Academy's chief psychologist, appearing beside Vex Prime. "Look at her, completely relaxed while everyone else is practically vibrating with anxiety." The human in question, according to her file, was named Maya Torres, age 26, from a backwater planet called Earth, no significant military background, and somehow she'd scored high enough on the preliminary tests to earn a seat in this prestigious examination. "Perhaps she doesn't understand the gravity of the situation," Vex Prime suggested, watching as Maya pulled out what appeared to be a snack and began munching contentedly. Dr. Kelvin's 3 heads tilted in unison. "Or perhaps she understands it better than we do." The examination began promptly at Galactic Standard Time 0800. Holographic displays materialized before each candidate, showing the same scenario, a detailed star map of the contested Helix Nebula region, complete with trade routes, military installations, and recent conflict zones. "Your task," Vex Prime announced, his voice echoing through the chamber, "is to identify the greatest threat to galactic peace and stability in this sector. You have 3 hours." Immediately, the hall erupted into focused activity. Candidates began manipulating their displays, zooming in on various elements, cross-referencing data streams, and making rapid calculations. The Krellians worked with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized like a hive mind. The Valorians attacked the problem with typical warrior directness, focusing on obvious military targets. Maya Torres, however, simply leaned back in her chair and stared at the display with what could only be described as mild interest. "Is her interface malfunctioning?" Lieutenant Grix whispered. "Run a diagnostic," Vex Prime ordered, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening here. The diagnostic came back clean. Maya's interface was working perfectly, she simply wasn't using it the way everyone else was. 20 minutes into the examination, she finally moved. But instead of manipulating the star map, she opened what appeared to be a cultural database and began reading about the various species represented in the scenario. Not their military capabilities or political alignments, but their art, their literature, their social customs. "What in the 7 moons is she doing?" Dr. Kelvin muttered. Meanwhile, the other candidates were deep in analysis. The Krellian delegation had identified the Shadowfang pirates as the primary threat, pointing to their recent raids on shipping lanes and their growing fleet strength. The Valorians had reached a similar conclusion, though they were also considering the possibility of intervention by the mysterious Void cult. The Zephyrians, ever the economists, were focused on a potential trade war between the mining consortiums of Belton 4 and the agricultural collectives of New Harvest. Their calculations showed how economic collapse in either system could destabilize the entire region. All perfectly reasonable conclusions from some of the brightest tactical minds in the galaxy. Maya Torres was reading poetry. Commander, Lieutenant Grix's voice carried a note of bewilderment. She's accessed the cultural archives for the Helix Nebula region. She's been reading for 47 minutes straight. Poetry, art criticism, historical novels, Dr. Kelvin added, his voice trailing off in confusion. Vex Prime watched the human with growing fascination. Either she was completely incompetent, or she was playing a game the rest of them didn't understand. Given that she'd somehow qualified for this examination, he was beginning to suspect the latter. At the 2-hour mark, something shifted in the examination hall. Several candidates were beginning to finalize their assessments, confident in their analytical conclusions. The Krellian team leader, a formidable specimen named Thex-99, had even begun the preliminary sketches for a military response plan. Torres closed the poetry archive and opened a new file, a seemingly mundane trade agreement between 3 minor systems on the outer rim of the Nebula region. Now what? Vex Prime wondered aloud. She read the entire document, all 47 pages of legal text, economic projections and shipping schedules. Then she cross-referenced it with immigration patterns, population densities, and something called cultural dissemination rates. With 30 minutes remaining, Maya finally activated the interactive elements of her display. But she didn't focus on the obvious threats that had captured everyone else's attention. Instead, she began tracing communication patterns between civilian populations across seemingly unrelated systems. She's mapping information flow, Dr. Kelvin realized suddenly. Not military intelligence or economic data, but cultural information. Stories, music, art. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. Ideas were spreading through the region, jumping from system to system along trade routes and communication networks. Not political manifestos or military plans, but something far more insidious, a gradual erosion of species-specific identity markers. Time, Vex Prime announced. The examination hall fell silent as candidates prepared their final presentations. According to protocol, each would have 5 minutes to present their findings to a panel of senior officers and academics. The Krellians went first, their presentation a masterpiece of tactical analysis. They identified 17 separate pirate organizations, mapped their supply chains, and proposed a coordinated military response that would eliminate the threat within 6 months. Impressive, thorough, and completely predictable. The Valorians followed with a similar but more aggressive approach, advocating for immediate preemptive strikes against anyone who looked suspicious. The Zephyrians focused on economic sanctions and trade route modifications. Each presentation was competent, well-researched, and addressed genuine threats to regional stability. Torres was called last. She stood slowly, gathering a single data pad, and walked to the presentation platform with the casual confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. The assembled evaluators watched with barely concealed skepticism as this unremarkable human prepared to justify her presence among the galaxy's elite tactical minds. Honorable evaluators. She began, her voice carrying a slight accent that several species found oddly soothing. My colleagues have identified numerous valid threats to stability in the Helix Nebula region. Pirates, economic disruption, political extremism, all genuine concerns that deserve attention. She paused, activating her display to show the same star map everyone had been analyzing. However, they've all missed the real threat. The one that's been operating openly, systematically, and with devastating effectiveness for the past 18 months. The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Several candidates exchanged skeptical glances, while the evaluators leaned forward with renewed interest. The greatest threat to galactic peace, Maya continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her words, isn't hiding in asteroid bases or plotting in secret councils. It's sitting right here in this room. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the environmental system seemed deafening. I'm sorry, Vex Prime interrupted, his voice tight with confusion, but are you suggesting that one of the examination candidates is a threat to galactic security? Maya smiled, and for the first time since the examination began, she looked genuinely amused. Not one of us, Commander. All of us. She gestured to the assembled candidates, her movement encompassing the entire hall. We represent the finest tactical minds from 17 different star systems. We've been trained to identify threats, neutralize enemies, and maintain stability through superior analysis and decisive action. We're the best and brightest the galaxy has to offer. Her smile widened. And that, gentlemen and beings of various genders, is exactly the problem. Dr. Kelvin's middle head tilted in confusion. I'm afraid I don't follow your logic. Of course you don't, Maya replied, her tone still pleasant, but now carrying an edge that made several candidates shift uncomfortably. Because you're all thinking like soldiers, economists, and politicians. You're looking for enemies to fight, problems to solve, and threats to eliminate. She activated a new display, showing the cultural analysis she'd been working on. But the real threat isn't something you can bomb, sanction, or negotiate with. It's an idea. Specifically, it's the idea that problems can be solved through superior analysis and decisive action by elite institutions like this one. The hall erupted in confused chatter, but Maya continued without pause. For the past 18 months, there's been a growing movement throughout the Helix Nebula region. It started small, just a few artists and writers sharing stories across species lines. Cultural exchange, you might call it. Harmless, even beneficial. Her display showed the communication patterns she'd mapped, the subtle flow of ideas between civilian populations. But something interesting happened when beings from different species started sharing their stories. They began to realize that despite their physical differences, they had remarkably similar concerns, similar hopes, fears, and frustrations. And that's a threat. Lieutenant Greeks asked, her tentacles writhing with confusion. It is when those similar concerns include a growing skepticism about the competence and necessity of their respective governments, Maya replied calmly. The display shifted, showing population surveys and polling data that most of the candidates had ignored as irrelevant to the security assessment. Citizens across the region are beginning to question why they need elaborate military bureaucracies to protect them from threats that seem to exist primarily to justify the existence of those same bureaucracies. They're asking uncomfortable questions about resource allocation, about the true cost of maintaining these vast security apparatuses, and about whether their leaders actually have their best interests at heart. Vex Prime felt a cold sensation spreading through his ceremonial sash. That's simply healthy democratic discourse. Is it? Maya asked, pulling up another data stream. Because the pattern analysis suggests something more significant. This isn't just casual political dissatisfaction. It's a coordinated ideological shift toward what humans call radical self-determination. The term hung in the air like a weapon. Citizens are beginning to believe that they can solve their own problems without waiting for permission from distant authorities. They're forming cross-species cooperatives, establishing independent trade networks, and creating cultural institutions that operate outside traditional governmental frameworks. She paused, letting the implications sink in. In 18 months, this movement has grown from a few scattered artistic collaborations to a network spanning 47 systems. They're not organizing armies or planning rebellions. They're simply ignoring us. The silence in the hall was now absolute. And that, Maya concluded, is the most dangerous threat any government can face. Not external enemies or internal rebels, but the quiet realization by ordinary citizens that they don't actually need us as much as we've convinced them they do. Dr. Kelvin's 3 heads were now moving in completely different directions, a sign of severe cognitive distress. But that would mean the threat you've identified is us, Maya finished gently. The entire military academic political complex that this academy represents. We're not protecting galactic peace. We're perpetuating the conditions that make peace impossible by insisting that complex problems require complex solutions managed by complex institutions. She gestured to her fellow candidates. Every person in this room has been trained to see threats that need to be managed rather than problems that might solve themselves if we simply stopped interfering. We've been conditioned to believe that our analysis is essential, our oversight is necessary, and our intervention is inevitable. Vex Prime's 4 eyes were blinking in completely different patterns, another sign of extreme distress. Are you suggesting that the solution to regional instability is to do nothing? I'm suggesting that the cause of regional instability might be our insistence on doing something, Maya replied. Every time we identify a threat and mount a response, we create new problems that require new responses. It's a self-perpetuating cycle that benefits no one except the institutions that exist to manage it. The truth of her words was beginning to sink in, and the assembled tactical minds of the galaxy were discovering that their finest analysis had led them to identify the wrong target entirely. The real threat wasn't hiding in the shadows or plotting in secret. It was sitting in row 3, calmly explaining why everything they believed about security, stability, and their own importance might be fundamentally wrong. And the most terrifying part was that she might be right. The examination hall remained frozen in stunned silence for exactly 47 seconds. Lieutenant Grix counted, because her species processed shock through precise time measurement, and this was definitely the most shocking moment of her career. That's Commander Vex Prime started, then stopped, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence like a malfunctioning traffic signal. That's preposterous. Maya Torres shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both agreement and complete indifference to his opinion. Is it? Let me ask you something, Commander. When was the last time you prevented a war? What kind of question is that? A simple one. You've been in military service for, 32 years? Your record shows involvement in the Belton conflict, the Zephyrian trade disputes, and the recent Shadowfang incident. 3 major interventions, 3 decisive victories for galactic peace. Vex Prime straightened, his ceremonial sash gleaming with pride. Exactly. We maintained stability through decisive action. And how many of those conflicts existed before your interventions were announced? The question hung in the air like a toxic gas cloud. Dr. Kelvin's head stopped their distressed wobbling. I'm not sure I understand the relevance of that inquiry. Maya activated another section of her display, showing timeline comparisons that made several candidates lean forward in their seats. The Belton conflict began 3 days after the Galactic Defense Council announced new security protocols for the Outer Rim. The Zephyrian trade dispute started immediately following a military build-up in their sector. And the Shadowfang pirates, they didn't exist as an organized force until 6 months after this academy graduated its largest class of tactical analysts. Thix 99, the Krellian team leader, made a sound like grinding crystal. Correlation does not imply causation, human. No, but it does suggest patterns worth examining, Maya replied pleasantly. Especially when those patterns repeat across 47 different systems over the past 2 decades. She pulled up a comprehensive analysis that none of the other candidates had even considered relevant to the examination. Every major conflict in the Helix Nebula region has followed the same sequence. Military assessment identifies potential threat, resources are deployed to monitor situation, local populations become aware of monitoring, tensions escalate, conflict becomes inevitable, decisive action is taken. Stability is restored until the next assessment cycle begins. The uncomfortable truth was spreading through the hall like a virus. Several candidates were now reviewing their own analyses with expressions of growing horror. But that's how security works, Lieutenant Grix protested weakly. You identify threats before they become unmanageable. Do you? Maya asked. Or do you create threats by treating peaceful populations as potential enemies? She gestured to the star map still glowing before each candidate. Look at your analyses. Every single one of you identified armed groups, economic pressures, or political movements as threats requiring intervention. Not one of you asked the obvious question, why do these threats keep appearing in areas where we've already established peace? The Valorian delegation was now whispering among themselves in their harsh, guttural language. Their scaled faces showed expressions that roughly translated to, "Oh, void take us all." "The poetry you were reading," Dr. Kelvin said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did it tell you?" Maya smiled, and for the first time since her presentation began, she looked genuinely pleased. "It told me that the citizens of the Helix Nebula region have been writing about their dreams for centuries. Dreams of exploration, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. But for the past 20 years, their poetry has changed. Now they write about surveillance, suspicion, and the constant fear that their neighbors might be enemies in disguise." She pulled up examples, translated into standard Galactic script. "Here's a verse from Kala 7, written last month. The Watchers came to keep us safe, but now we watch each other, wondering who among us looks dangerous to distant eyes that see only threats where friendship used to grow." The words hit the assembled tactical minds like physical blows. "And here's one from New Harvest. They count our ships and measure our trade, seeking patterns in our daily bread that might spell doom for strangers we have never met, until we too begin to see enemies in every unfamiliar face." Commander Vex Prime was now making small, distressed sounds that his species produced when confronting cognitive dissonance. "You're suggesting that our security measures are creating insecurity?" "I'm suggesting that your security measures are working exactly as designed," Maya replied. "They're creating a state of permanent low-level tension that justifies their own existence while preventing the natural development of inter-system cooperation." She activated the final section of her analysis, showing projection models that made the entire evaluation panel lean back in their chairs. "If current trends continue, the Helix Nebula region will experience escalating conflicts for the next century. Each war will be larger than the last, each peace more fragile, each intervention more necessary." The projections were mathematically elegant and terrifyingly plausible. However, Maya continued, if military oversight were withdrawn gradually over the next 5 years, allowing natural economic and cultural exchange to develop without surveillance, the models suggest something different. The new projections showed a region of unprecedented cooperation and prosperity. No more pirates, because trade routes would be protected by merchant cooperatives. No more territorial disputes, because boundaries would become irrelevant to people who see themselves as part of a larger community. No more resource wars, because sharing would be more profitable than hoarding. Thix 99 made the Krellian sound for impossible mathematics. "The models assume rational actors making informed decisions," he protested. "But beings are not rational. They are driven by fear, greed, and tribal loyalties." "Are they?" Maya asked. "Or have they learned to be driven by those things because that's what our security paradigm expects from them?" She showed cultural analysis from systems outside the Helix Nebula region, areas where military presence was minimal, in regions where the Galactic Defense Council maintains only token observation posts. Interspecies cooperation is the norm. Citizens focus on trade, art, and technological development. Conflicts are resolved through negotiation and compromise. "But those are peaceful systems," Lieutenant Grix objected. "They don't face the same threats." "Don't they? Or do they face the same challenges but respond differently because they haven't been trained to see everything as a potential threat?" Maya pulled up comparative data that made the distinction clear. Systems with heavy military oversight report an average of 12 security incidents per year. Systems with minimal oversight report an average of 2. The difference isn't in the challenges they face, but in how those challenges are interpreted and addressed. The examination hall was now filled with the sound of candidates frantically reviewing their own data, looking for flaws in Maya's analysis. They found none. Dr. Kelvin's 3 heads were now moving in perfect synchronization, a sign that his species was approaching a moment of profound understanding. "You're saying that we've created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By expecting threats, we've created the conditions that make threats inevitable." "I'm saying that you've built a machine that converts normal social friction into armed conflict, then congratulates itself for managing the resulting violence," Maya replied. "But without security institutions," Commander Vex Prime protested desperately, "there would be chaos. Natural disasters, resource shortages, technological accidents, who would coordinate responses to genuine emergencies. Maya's smile became almost gentle. The same people who coordinate responses now, except they'd do it more efficiently because they wouldn't need to route everything through military bureaucracies designed for conflict management. She showed disaster response data from both types of systems. When the solar flares hit the Andorian system last year, civilian response teams had the situation under control within 6 hours. When similar flares hit the militarized Kepler sector, it took 3 days to coordinate a response because everything had to go through proper security channels. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely devastating to everything the assembled tactical minds had been taught to believe. "So what are you proposing?" Vex Prime asked, his voice now completely defeated. "That we simply dissolve the Galactic Defense Council." "I'm not proposing anything," Maya said, packing up her data pad with the same casual efficiency she'd displayed throughout the examination. "I was asked to identify the greatest threat to galactic peace and stability. I've done that." She headed toward the exit, then paused and looked back at the stunned assembly. "What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Though I should mention that the cultural movement I described, the one that's been spreading across 47 systems, they're not waiting for your permission to build the kind of galaxy they want to live in." "What do you mean?" Dr. Kelvan called after her. Maya's final smile was radiant. "I mean that while you've all been busy looking for threats to fight, they've been busy making those threats irrelevant. The Helix Nebula Cooperative was officially established this morning. 47 systems, unified economic framework, shared defense responsibilities, and completely independent of any existing governmental authority." The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of minds trying to process information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. "They've seceded?" Lieutenant Grix whispered. "They've evolved," Maya replied. "And unless you want to spend the next century fighting an increasingly pointless war against people who simply want to be left alone to build something better, you might want to consider evolving too." She walked out of the examination hall, leaving behind the finest tactical minds in the galaxy to contemplate the possibility that everything they'd dedicated their lives to might be not just wrong, but actively harmful. Commander Vex Prime looked around at the assembled candidates, all of whom were now staring at their displays with expressions of existential dread. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 32 years of military service that might have been completely misguided, "I suppose we should discuss how to grade this examination." Somewhere in the distance they could hear Maya Torres laughing. It wasn't a cruel laugh, or a mocking one. It was the sound of someone who had spent 3 hours watching the galaxy's brightest minds work very hard to miss the obvious, and found the whole situation more amusing than tragic. The real threat had been sitting in row 3 all along, not because she was dangerous, but because she was right. And sometimes being right is the most threatening thing of all. 3 months later, the Galactic Defense Academy quietly revised its curriculum to include courses on cooperative security paradigms and non-interventionist conflict resolution. The changes were implemented by a new Director of Educational Development, a position created specifically for Maya Torres, who accepted it on the condition that she could work from her home system, which was now officially an independent member of the Helix Nebula Cooperative. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Commander Vex Prime, for his part, took early retirement and opened a small cafe on a peaceful outer rim world where the biggest security threat was making sure the coffee didn't get cold. He was, by all accounts, much happier. And the galaxy slowly but surely learned to solve its problems without first creating bigger ones. The threat in row 3 had turned out to be hope disguised as analysis, which was perhaps the most human thing of all.